So a thought I had the other day while watching a video about trauma is that the video was talking about how trauma is not really just like when you get triggered by something that you've had trauma from. In the particular moment you have certain bodily sensations, but there are also certain memories from the past that gets triggered, right? And trauma is neither the specific memories stored nor just the sensory sensations that you feel in your body in this moment, but it's some relationship between the two that kind of makes up trauma. So trauma is not either or, but kind of both things. And related to that were a few other things that I've been thinking about. So one is this idea of kind of your raw sensory data. So what I mean by this is the idea that, for example, the color that we call blue for the sky is, you and I will never know whether the same color that we are pointing at to the sky, which we both refer to as blue, is really the same shade of color that each of us see through our own eyes, interpreted in our brains as exactly the same shade of color, or even really the same family of color. And with the way that we are right now and the way that technology is right now, there's no way for us to find out. For all I know, when I'm pointing to the color blue and I see a color that to me references as blue, you might be seeing a color that references to me as red, but we will never know this because we will both point at the same thing and we will both use the same name to call it blue. And what I mean by this is that there is inherently a layer of very personal, subjective, sensory experience that we each experience that we cannot experience from any other means besides ourselves, our own body, our own vessel. And at the same time, there is that level of shared interpretation, which is, in the case of the color, let's say blue, we have done sort of a societal calibration of the sky is blue, for example. So when we both use the word blue, we know what it means because we have a common reference point, which is, for example, the sky, the sea, other things that are blue that we can point at, right? So that level of interpretation carries within it some level of social agreement or social calibration. And then two other things that were relevant to whatever I want to talk about today, which is kind of all over the place, but that's fine. So the other two things are, one, the idea of taste. So somewhat related to the idea of colors is something else about the color of taste. And for me, this was about coffee. I had a conversation with other coffee people about cupping. I'm not the most familiar, they had much more experience than I do, and they were saying how in public cuppings, different people can come to the cupping, and then when they taste the same coffee, different people might say this cup of coffee tastes. For example, I might say it tastes like peaches, somebody else might say apricot, somebody else might say it has more of a plummy taste. And so the thing with cupping, or a team of coffee professionals who work together, is that there needs to be a bit of this sense of shared understanding or a shared calibration of when we all drink this particular cup of coffee, maybe I taste, what was the thing that I said? I can't remember. So let's say I taste plum, somebody else tastes apricot, but there is a certain commonality in which they're all stone fruits. So maybe then we can agree that our first level of interpretation is it is stone fruits. Because kind of the level of interpretation of this is plum, this is apricot or whatever, is our very first level of interpretation, our way of expressing what we inherently sense within our own body, our own senses, and that is a very subjective experience. It's just that with color, we have had much more chances to kind of say this thing is this color, that thing is this other color, and therefore we have a much better social calibration of what particular colors are. But with coffee, it's not a particular skill that most people would have had needed to hone, and therefore when we first try to articulate what we are tasting sensorially in our tongues and in our palates, it's a bit difficult to put to words, right? It doesn't come to us as easily as colors, which is something that we are more used to doing just by virtue of the fact that most of us will have encountered colors much earlier on in our lives. So we don't think about it that way. But when it comes to something like taste, which is perhaps not as frequently socially calibrated as something like colors, we can start to see some of this stratification of your own personal subjective experience and how we come to verbalize it and then socially calibrate it. So inherent in all of this are different levels of interpretation. So the fourth thing that is related to this is another post, which is a Tumblr post that I saw from somewhere else. But the idea is that a therapist is meant to be a person that is removed from your social context, meaning they're essentially a stranger to everybody else in your life but you. So when you tell them things, they can give you a somewhat outsider perspective of what is maybe typical or what is a socially calibrated kind of norm. So like whether maybe certain behaviors are unhealthy or maladaptive, they can be the ones to point it out to you because perhaps around you, your friends and family all think that that is pretty normal, but a therapist would have a much larger pool of case or a better knowledge, way of understanding to kind of tell you, yeah, maybe this is not the healthiest way to relate to somebody else. Whereas your friends and family are people that are in the same context as you and therefore are able to socially calibrate things for you within that context. And you kind of need both, was the point that the Tumblr post was making. So what do these four things kind of come together to say for me? And I think this is a bit of a preliminary thought process, but I think for me, I've always known that on whichever level it is, my experience of the world differs quite a bit from what other people tend to experience. Of course, everybody's subjective perspective of the world is slightly different. Like I said, we will never be able to know anybody else's personal subjective experience other than our own, just by the way we are built. And the only way we can begin to even understand that is by talking, by communicating, by comparison. And like I said in the example for the coffee tasting, when it's something that you are not socially calibrated to do well, and you're just, on your own trying out for the first time using words to best express what you can, what you say and what somebody else say, you might both be referring to the same thing. In that case, for example, the cup of coffee that I was talking about, but I might say plum and you might say apricot, and actually I have no idea whether you really taste exactly the same thing as I do, but we can kind of have some social calibration of, okay, let's agree that it tastes kind of like stone fruit, right? But then like exactly what, maybe we can't really agree. And maybe that's a useful enough definition. So I think the idea with all these different examples of calibration of your own personal subjective experience, the way you kind of initially verbalize it, and then the socially calibrated way of looking at it, is coming back to my understanding of trauma. And I think the idea that like, not specifically just trauma, I guess, but perhaps why me and other people can go through similar experiences and I might be more strongly affected by it than other people. And that it's hard for other people who don't quite get traumatized in the same way to understand why it has affected me so much. And I think it can happen on any of this level. definitely, I would say, happens on the sensorial level, in which my subjective experience, the things that I take in and the things that they have taken in are different. And I think this is something that you can kind of start to get a better sense of the more you compare notes on different shared incidents that happen. And I think this is something that we kind of inherently know in other contexts. Maybe, like, for example, when two different people walk into the room, they might notice very different things on first sight. Like, some people might start noticing faces, are these familiar people, unfamiliar people, and then somebody else might start noticing things like, I don't know, the lights are very bright, the sound system is very loud, and all of this preferential way of taking in information is subjective to the person. But there is some consistency in how it appears for each person over a period of time, right? I mean, over time. So there is some consistency in that. For example, I might be somebody who always goes into a room and notices that the temperature of the room is too cold or too hot. Like, maybe that is something that I'm sensitive about. It's not, by the way, but that was just the example that I had. And therefore, I think a lot of the times when we talk about certain events that happen and how some people might end up being more traumatized by said events than other people, it is on one level, first, that there is differences in the primary sensory input that we have individually taken in and how that might already be different. Second of all, that our own personal interpretation of it, which is based on our own past context, right? So remember what I was saying at the start, all the way at the start of this video about trauma. It's partially your current physical sensations, but also your past memories and all the stories that you've had about what happened. So even though two of us might be experiencing the same event in the now, the two of us may not have had the same past experience. Or even if we had the same past experience, we may not have had the same stories about those experiences. So that will contribute to another layer of difference. And the last level of difference is there might just be, not a good enough common calibrated understanding of what we're talking about, which is built on the previous two layers, right? So when I was thinking about all this, like, it was just like, these four things just came together in my mind, and I can't really put them all accurately down into words, but I think it starts to give me a better understanding of, like, why certain things have affected me in a way that maybe they may not have affected other people, and that it is perfectly okay and acceptable that it has been that way. And maybe some of the ways to kind of retell the stories in a way that is more helpful to me can then be found in the levels of interpretation that build up from the sensory inputs that I'm feeling in the moment. Because I think it's a bit difficult for me to change how I've taken in the raw data through my senses. But that very first level of interpretation, in which I might just think plum because maybe I've eaten plum and then I haven't had a lot of apricot. So when I taste a coffee that is more stone fruit tasting, the fruit that comes to mind is plum. Whereas for somebody else, maybe they have had more apricots and not plums, and therefore when they taste that coffee, they might think apricot instead of plum, right? So yeah. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that maybe it is in there the levels of interpretation that the stories can then be rewritten. But exactly how that would be done, I don't know. That's kind of like where I've reached with my thoughts about this. So I'm gonna leave this here so that I have something to look back on if I have more thoughts on this. And that's all for this video. Thank you for watching this brain dump, and I'll see you next time.